Hey dear restless mind. Tonight, imagine the hush of a chamber lit only by wavering flames, shadows sliding across limestone walls like silent dancers. Heavy curtains filter out the noises of Alexandria's bustling streets, leaving you with the faint crackle of oil lamps and the perfume of crushed lotus drifting in the air. The marble floor feels cool beneath your bare feet, the same marble Cleopatra herself might have paced, her mind restless with schemes and dreams. You'd probably never make it through a single Egyptian night, the smoke, the insects, the lack of air conditioning. But don't worry, I'll guide you safely through. So, before we go any further, if this quiet company helps, you can gently tap like and subscribe, but only if it feels right to your heart. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Maybe lying awake in New York or drifting in a quiet room in London. Drop your time and place below, so none of us feel alone tonight. Now, dim the lights, let your shoulders relax, and let's begin tonight's slow, strange journey. Together, here on Timeless Sleep. The world Cleopatra VII inherited was already complicated, a woven net of politics, spectacle, and survival. Egypt in the 1st century BCE was both majestic and fragile, rich with wheat and gold, but entangled in debts to Rome. The Ptolemies, Cleopatra's dynasty, had ruled for nearly 300 years, ever since the general Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's old drinking buddies, decided Egypt looked like a fine place to set up shop. Picture Alexander's empire crumbling like a dropped clay jug, shards scattered from Greece to India. Ptolemy snatched the Egyptian shard and polished it until it gleamed like a crown. By Cleopatra's time, though, that crown sat a little too heavy, and cracks were already spidering through it. Cleopatra's reign begins with a dramatic image. An 18-year-old queen stepping into a throne room bigger than a football field, flanked by columns painted with lotus and papyrus. She isn't alone, though. By the odd rules of the dynasty, she's married to her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII. Imagine your sibling with jam on their face still learning to multiply, and then imagine sharing a crown with them. That was Cleopatra's awkward royal reality. To soften the absurdity, Ptolemaic propaganda spun brother-sister marriage as divine, copying the gods Isis and Osiris. Translation: sure, it's weird, but the gods did it, so relax. You can already see how the stage was set for a life equal parts glamour and soap opera. One thing that makes Cleopatra weirdly different from her predecessors is how she actually threw herself into Egyptian culture. The Ptolemies before her mostly acted like aloof landlords, sipping imported Greek wine, speaking Greek, and treating the local Egyptian language like background noise. Cleopatra. She broke the trend. She learned to speak Egyptian fluently, along with half a dozen other languages, just because why not conquer linguistics while I'm at it? This alone made her stand out. Imagine if every US president only spoke French for 300 years, and then suddenly one of them went on live TV and gave a fluent speech in English. That was the shock Cleopatra delivered. She sounded like her people. It was a brilliant way of saying, I may have Macedonian blood, but my heart is carved in hieroglyphs. But her throne wasn't just threatened by foreign debts and family rivalries. It was also threatened by Roman gossip. The Roman elite had a full-time hobby of mocking foreign queens, and Cleopatra was their favourite target. Even before she became Caesar's partner, rumours swirled like sandstorms. Was she a witch? A seductress? Did she bathe in milk, honey, or perhaps the tears of her political enemies. If ancient Twitter had existed, you'd have seen hashtags like #AspQueen, #SiblingSpouse, and #PearlCocktail trending daily. Her political instincts, though, were razor sharp. She realised early that Egypt couldn't outmuscle Rome, but it could out-entertain it. Alexandria was essentially the Las Vegas of the ancient Mediterranean. Glittering libraries, lighthouses taller than skyscrapers, streets bustling with scholars, sailors, gamblers, and mystics. Cleopatra leaned into this theatre. Every appearance was staged. Her dress wasn't just silk, it was a political billboard. Her makeup wasn't vanity, it was branding. Eyeliner became a diplomatic weapon sharper than any spear. But before you picture Cleopatra as only the schemer, remember she was also walking on eggshells. Her younger siblings plotted against her. Nobles whispered. Roman generals eyed Egypt's wealth, the way you eye the last slice of cake at a party. She had to project confidence even when everything beneath her throne felt like quicksand. Imagine being 18, stuck in a sibling marriage, ruling a kingdom in debt, and still managing to throw banquets that made your enemies jealous. You'd probably have a permanent stress rash. Cleopatra, instead, wore shimmering gold and diamonds like armour. The very throne room where she first appeared told its own story. High ceilings painted midnight blue with silver stars, columns carved into lotus blooms. On the walls, reliefs of pharaohs smiting enemies, as though every brick wanted to remind visitors that Egypt always wins. Cleopatra leaned on this ancient imagery, wrapping herself in its weight. Unlike her forebears, who leaned Greek, she adopted Egyptian titles and rituals. She appeared as Isis, mother and goddess, making sure everyone knew she wasn't just a queen, but practically a deity in human form. Call it early influencer marketing. Here's the strange thing. Though history paints Cleopatra as constantly dripping in luxury, some sources suggest she was surprisingly thrifty when it came to personal indulgences. She knew that flaunting wealth too much would make her nobles mutter and Rome glare harder. So her legendary excess, pearls in wine, golden fleets, scented sails, may have been carefully staged once-in-a-lifetime performances designed to shock. Think of it like Beyoncé's halftime show. Dazzling, unforgettable, but not her daily routine. Her genius lay in walking the razor's edge between spectacle and survival. Take her relationship with religion. She didn't just borrow Isis's imagery. She leaned into rituals that would strike modern audiences as bizarre. Priests chanted in her name. Statues bore her face merged with goddesses. Citizens bowed not just to a monarch but to a living myth. Imagine if your local mayor declared themselves the reincarnation of a deity and expected you to clap. You'd probably laugh. But in Cleopatra's world, that laughter could cost you your life. Then there's her famous entrances. Plutarch tells us she once sailed up the river to meet Mark Antony, in a ship with purple sails, silver oars, and servants fanning clouds of incense. The crowd went wild. But the detail that always sticks. She reclined under a canopy, dressed as Aphrodite, with children dressed as winged cupids at her side. Translation: Hi, Antony, I'm literally love embodied, and also your boss now. Cleopatra didn't just walk into a room. She made gravity shift toward her. In these early years, though, before Caesar, before Antony, before the Asp legend, Cleopatra was still sharpening her performance. Her throne room scenes, her language skills, her odd marriage, all of it built the foundation for her later legend. Even the simplest details, like how she styled her hair in tight braids or oiled her skin with palm resin, carried weight. Every gesture was a message. Every rumour became a weapon. Every flick of coal eyeliner might as well have been a sword slash across Rome's pride. And yet, beneath the grandeur, she was also a young woman pacing marble floors at night, probably replaying every word, every glance, every whisper. Her story begins in candlelit silence, not just in blazing spectacle. And it's here, in these early moments of her reign, that the strangest thing of all happens. She begins to believe her own myth. That's when Cleopatra truly becomes Cleopatra. Not just a queen, but the living, breathing story that would outlast empires. The marble under your bare feet cools as you wander deeper into Cleopatra's palace. Corridors lined with mosaics that glitter like frozen stars. Each tile is a fragment of two worlds, the Egypt of pyramids and temples, and the Greece of philosophers and wine-soaked poets. Cleopatra's dynasty was a collision of these worlds, and to understand how strange she truly was, you need to trace her roots back to their beginning. Her bloodline wasn't Egyptian at all, it was Macedonian Greek, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals. Imagine the chaos after Alexander's death. Generals squabbling like toddlers, fighting over who gets the biggest slice of cake. Only the cake was half the known world. Ptolemy, one of his closest companions, snatched Egypt and held onto it like a dog guarding a bone. His descendants would keep it for nearly 3 centuries, speaking Greek, marrying siblings, and ruling from Alexandria, a city as Greek as it was Egyptian. You might expect that after 300 years in Egypt, the Ptolemies would have blended in, wearing linen kilts and building pyramids. Not at all. They clung stubbornly to their Hellenistic identity, draping themselves in togas, reading Homer, and throwing parties where Greek drama was staged while Egyptian priests sulked in the background. Picture someone moving into your house, ignoring your furniture, refusing to learn your language, and insisting you change your decor to match theirs. That was the Ptolemaic vibe. Imperious house guests who never left. Cleopatra's family tree was less a tree and more a tangled knot of vines choking each other. Brother married sister, uncle married niece, cousins tangled with cousins, until the family portraits looked more like a loop of repetition than a branching heritage. The logic, to keep pure Macedonian blood. The reality, a royal gene pool so shallow you could wade across without getting your ankles wet. By Cleopatra's generation, it was considered normal for a girl to marry her 10-year-old brother and call it destiny. If that doesn't scream awkward dinner table, nothing does. And yet Cleopatra herself, the 7th of her name, broke that mould. Not entirely, she still had to play the sibling marriage card for public image, but she leaned into Egyptian traditions in a way that shocked her Greek ancestors. Where they had scorned Egyptian language, she learned it. Where they had treated Egyptian gods as political props, she embodied them. She presented herself not just as queen, but as Isis reborn, wrapping herself in linen robes and golden crowns shaped like cobras, saying to her people, "I am not just ruling over you, I am your goddess made flesh." Imagine your local governor suddenly dressing as Wonder Woman and insisting you light incense to her every morning. Only Cleopatra somehow made it work. The strangeness of her identity was its strength. She was both foreign and native, both Greek aristocrat and Egyptian pharaoh, both politician and performer. To the Greeks of Alexandria, she was a cultured Hellenistic monarch who could debate philosophy. To the Egyptians along the Nile, she was pharaoh, heir of the gods, protector of the crops and the floodwaters. It was a dual identity that let her slip between worlds like a shapeshifter. This duality carried into her personal habits. Sources suggest she could entertain Greek philosophers with witty banter, then turn around and preside over Egyptian temple rituals with solemn dignity. Imagine switching between Netflix commentary and chanting liturgy without missing a beat. She had to, because Egypt itself was a split nation. Alexandria, dazzling and cosmopolitan, filled with Greeks, Jews and merchants from every shore, and the countryside, stubbornly Egyptian, worshipping Horus and Ra as if Alexander had never conquered a grain of sand. Cleopatra had to speak both worlds fluently, and she did. The gossip about her ancestry also added to the mystique. Some Romans whispered that she had Oriental blood from earlier dynastic intermarriages. Others sneered that she was more Egyptian than Greek because of her devotion to Isis. The truth is murky, but the rumours themselves were part of her power. They made her exotic, mysterious, hard to pin down. She wasn't just another Hellenistic princess. She was something stranger, something that made Roman senators nervous and poets inspired. One of the weirdest aspects of her dynasty was its obsession with portraying itself as divine. Earlier, Ptolemies had built massive temples where they were worshipped alongside Egyptian gods. Cleopatra inherited that tradition but dialed it up. She wasn't content with statues in temples, she embodied the goddess in person. During festivals she would appear as Isis herself, draped in gold with a crown of the horns and a sun disk glowing above her head. Citizens would kneel as incense smoked, and whispers would ripple through the crowd. Is she mortal or divine? It was half religion, half theatre, and entirely propaganda. Her connection to the gods wasn't just ceremonial, it seeped into politics. By presenting herself as Isis, Cleopatra framed her marriage to her brother as a divine mirror of Osiris and Isis, smoothing over the awkwardness. It's the kind of logic that makes you want to roll your eyes. It's not gross, it's holy. Romans, of course, mocked this mercilessly. Cicero once sneered that the Egyptians worshipped cats and onions, and Cleopatra's divine cosplay fit neatly into their stereotype of Egyptian absurdity. Yet for Egyptians themselves, it worked. They saw their queen as a living deity who cared for their crops and floods. Cleopatra also embraced Egyptian ritual in ways that baffled her Greek peers. She took part in Nile fertility rites, blessed temples, and commissioned statues in the old pharaonic style. Her face carved serene and timeless. On one hand, she was hosting Greek banquets where philosophers quoted Plato. On the other, she was blessing bulls as sacred incarnations of Apis. Talk about cultural multitasking. Her embrace of Egypt wasn't just religious, it was practical. By aligning herself with Egyptian traditions, she secured loyalty from the countryside, the farmers who fed Alexandria and indirectly Rome itself. Grain was Egypt's gold, and whoever controlled the harvest controlled power. Cleopatra's choice to present herself as Egyptian wasn't some quirky hobby. It was a survival strategy wrapped in eyeliner. Still, her Greek heritage shaped her too. She was educated like a Hellenistic intellectual. Geometry, astronomy, philosophy, medicine. She read Homer, debated rhetoric, studied herbs, and likely rolled her eyes at endless cousin marriage negotiations. Her brain was as sharp as her costumes were dazzling. Roman writers who hated her admitted grudgingly that she was brilliant. One even complained she could bend men with her words as if with chains, which, if you think about it, is probably the best LinkedIn endorsement you could hope for. So here you have her, Cleopatra, born into a dynasty of Greek conquerors, raised in Alexandria's glittering palaces, but choosing to wear the cobra crown of an Egyptian pharaoh. She straddled two worlds, slipping between Greek philosophy and Egyptian ritual like a dancer moving between steps. This dual identity wasn't just unusual, it was weird, unsettling, and unforgettable. It made her enemies underestimate her, and it made her people worship her. And maybe that's the strangest thing of all, that the last great pharaoh of Egypt wasn't really Egyptian at all, but a Greek girl who learned how to turn identity into a weapon sharper than any sword. Her weird ancestry, tangled marriages, and divine cosplay set the stage for everything to come. The romances, the scandals, the pearl cocktails, and yes, the snakes. The air in Alexandria is thick with the scent of salt from the harbour, and smoke from torches burning through the night. You wander past marble colonnades where merchants bicker in Greek, scribes whisper in Hebrew, and priests chant in Egyptian. In the middle of this swirl of tongues, Cleopatra herself moves like a conductor in front of an orchestra, speaking to each in their own language. That is her strangest, sharpest weapon. Words. Unlike her Ptolemaic ancestors who barely bothered to learn Egyptian, Cleopatra became a polyglot extraordinaire. Ancient writers tell us she spoke at least 7 or 8 languages, maybe even more, and never needed an interpreter when dealing with foreign envoys. Imagine walking into the United Nations today and casually switching between Russian, Mandarin, Arabic and Latin, just to keep everyone slightly off balance. Cleopatra could do that without missing a beat. Her choice to master languages was more than personal curiosity. It was political survival. Egypt sat on the crossroads of the Mediterranean, with embassies arriving daily from Nubia, Ethiopia, Judea, Arabia, and beyond. Every rival language was another battlefield. By speaking them directly, Cleopatra stripped power from interpreters and spun the conversation her way. Rome in particular loomed large, senators and generals prowling like wolves. and Cleopatra made sure she could charm them in their own tongue. In a world where women were expected to smile politely while men did the talking, she hijacked the script and wrote her own dialogue. The ability to code switch like this made her seem almost supernatural to contemporaries. Roman sources, half in awe and half in bitterness, called her voice enchanting, like many instruments played together. Translation: she could flatter you in your mother tongue and then insult you in Greek poetry before you even realized it was happening. Some claim she even dabbled in the tongues of barbarian tribes, Gauls, Medes, Parthians. Whether that's true or just a rumour, the fact that anyone believed it shows how unsettling her talent was. Think of how rare this was among her peers. Most monarchs in antiquity were content to issue orders in their one native tongue and let translators fumble the details. Cleopatra refused to let words be filtered. She wanted raw, direct connection, the kind that makes even hardened ambassadors feel they've been seen. If her makeup and golden robes dazzled the eyes, her voice ensnared the ears. That's the double act that made her unforgettable. Of course, language skill also became one of her more bizarre hobbies. Sources suggest she enjoyed playing with words, testing puns, reciting riddles, twisting idioms from one language into another. You can almost picture her lounging on a divan, sipping wine, and confusing a Roman envoy with some obscure Phoenician wordplay until he didn't know whether to laugh or surrender. If TikTok existed, Cleopatra would have gone viral daily with polyglot skits. Her command of Egyptian itself was radical. For centuries, her dynasty had ruled Egypt like absentee landlords, never learning the language of the farmers who grew the grain. By speaking it fluently, Cleopatra positioned herself as one of them. Priests adored her, commoners revered her, and nobles grudgingly respected her. It was as if she cracked the code that had kept Greeks and Egyptians apart for generations. Suddenly, the foreign queen sounded like their pharaoh. Imagine if the British royals suddenly switched to speaking flawless Punjabi or Swahili. It would shock, charm, and unsettle all at once. But Cleopatra didn't stop with spoken languages. She also immersed herself in the visual language of hieroglyphs, commissioning inscriptions where her name appeared alongside gods, written not in Greek but in the ancient script of Egypt. Her cartouche carved in temples was more than vanity. It was a declaration that she belonged to this land as much as the Nile itself. Even her choice of titles blurred boundaries. She was Philopator in Greek, father-loving, but also the new Isis in Egyptian, mother of all. The polyglot queen also dipped her hands into the sciences of words. Scholars whisper she studied medicine texts in their original Greek and Egyptian, debated astronomy with priests, and learned herbal remedies from Nubian healers. This wasn't the usual dabbling of a monarch. It was obsession. She wanted to know the language of plants, of stars, of bodies. To the Romans, this looked suspiciously like witchcraft. To Egyptians, it looked like wisdom. To modern ears, it sounds like Cleopatra was basically running a one-woman TED Talk series centuries before microphones. Her weirdness extended to her sense of performance. She seemed to know instinctively that switching languages wasn't just about communication, it was about spectacle. Imagine her walking into a room filled with foreign envoys. She greets the Syrians in their own tongue, the Ethiopians in theirs, the Jews in Hebrew, the Romans in Latin, then swivels back to her courtiers in Greek without a stutter. The room would buzz with awe, each group whispering, "She is ours!" And in that moment she wasn't theirs at all, she was queen. The Romans naturally turned this talent into a weapon against her in gossip. They painted her as a manipulator, a temptress who bewitched men with words. Cicero, eternally grumpy, complained about her arrogance and insolence. Translation: she talked back, and worse, she made sense. To misogynistic senators, a woman who could argue in multiple languages was more terrifying than 1,000 war elephants. Cleopatra exploited that fear, turning their unease into advantage. One of the strangest rumours is that Cleopatra sometimes disguised herself among commoners, slipping into markets or temples while speaking perfect Egyptian, blending in so seamlessly that people didn't realise the queen was among them. Whether true or not, the story captures something real. Her voice wasn't distant or lofty. It could be intimate, familiar. disarmingly close. She didn't only sit on thrones, she could step into the crowd and sound like the woman next door. You begin to see how her polyglot gift shaped every part of her reign. It wasn't just about dazzling audiences or surviving diplomacy. It was her shield and her sword, her disguise and her crown. Every language she learned was another thread in the net she cast over allies and enemies alike. Without it, she might have been remembered as just another Ptolemaic ruler, trapped in the marble halls of Alexandria. With it, she became Cleopatra, a woman who made even hardened Romans shiver when she spoke. And maybe that's the weirdest thing of all. Her empire wasn't built just on armies or gold, but on syllables, accents, and carefully chosen words. In a world where power usually came from steel, she proved it could also come from syntax. And once you've been charmed by someone in your mother tongue, it's hard to ever see them as foreign again. The palace air grows heavy with resinous smoke, as jars of frankincense and myrrh opened, their scent mixing with sweeter oils pressed from roses and cinnamon bark. Tonight, picture yourself walking into Cleopatra's private chambers, not a sterile room of scrolls and tablets, but a miniature apothecary of perfumes, ointments, and bizarre concoctions that blur the line between medicine, beauty, and outright witchcraft. Here lies one of her strangest legacies, the art of seduction carried on the shoulders of scent, texture, and imagination. You might think you're just slathering lotion on dry hands, but in Cleopatra's world that lotion could be a political weapon. Perfume was Cleopatra's love language and also her battlefield. Ancient writers, especially Plutarch, record that when she sailed to meet Mark Antony, the very air smelled of her before she even appeared. Sails were drenched in perfume, decks rubbed with oils, servants scattering incense into the wind. Imagine Tinder, but instead of swiping, you simply smell someone's presence half a mile away and decide they're irresistible. Cleopatra understood the primal force of scent long before marketing firms bottled it. The recipes themselves were strange and sometimes alarming. Egyptian perfumery was already legendary. Priests burned kefir, a resinous blend of wine, honey, myrrh, raisins, and frankincense at temples each evening. Cleopatra inherited that tradition and experimented further. Historians tell us she had her own perfume workshop near the Dead Sea, where specialists mixed concoctions of cedarwood, cinnamon, cardamom, rose, and pine resin. Some scholars think remnants of her formulas may still linger in ruins today. The weirdest twist. One ancient source hints she may have used crocodile dung as a base for certain ointments, a natural sunscreen with the added perk of terrifying anyone who asked too many questions. Translation: yes, it smells odd, but at least I won't wrinkle like papyrus. Her cosmetic routines were equally extravagant and bizarre. Cleopatra was famous for her kohl eyeliner, a black mixture that not only dramatized her eyes, but also had antibacterial properties, reducing the risk of infection in Egypt's dusty climate. To her, eyeliner wasn't just vanity, it was science, and maybe a touch of sorcery. Imagine smudging mascara, then casually claiming you're protecting yourself from desert demons. Suddenly your morning routine sounds heroic. Even stranger were the skin treatments. Accounts, some satirical, some serious, claim Cleopatra bathed in milk, sometimes donkey's milk, sometimes goat's, to soften her skin. The image of hundreds of donkeys lined up daily to fill a bath for one queen feels absurd enough to be true. Romans loved mocking this idea, picturing Cleopatra lounging in frothy tubs like the world's first spa influencer. Whether she really soaked in dairy or not, the rumour itself worked as propaganda. This queen is so luxurious, even her baths could feed a village. Scent and sight blended in her use of flower garlands and oils. She would weave roses into her hair, soak her clothing in perfume, and powder her skin with crushed petals. Her very presence became a sensory ambush. Ancient sources exaggerate, of course, they always do, but the essence is clear. Cleopatra was a master of turning cosmetics into theatre. Walk into her presence and you weren't just meeting a ruler. You were drowning in an atmosphere, like stepping into a scented cloud where your senses stopped trusting you. One of the quirkiest stories comes from her rumoured pearl cocktail. According to Pliny, she once bet Mark Antony that she could consume the most expensive meal in history. She took a priceless pearl earring, dissolved it in vinegar, and drank it. Science debates whether pearls can really dissolve that quickly, but the story spread like wildfire. Romans ate it up, figuratively, thank goodness. To them it was proof that Cleopatra was decadent, reckless, weird beyond measure. To Cleopatra it was a performance, a reminder that wealth to her was not something to hoard but something to annihilate in front of an audience. Imagine someone today lighting a cigar with a $100 bill, then calmly eating the ash. That was Cleopatra's vibe. Shocking, unforgettable, impossible to imitate. The strangeness of her perfume obsession reached beyond her lifetime. In the ruins of ancient Egyptian temples, researchers have found amphorae still crusted with resinous residue from oils thought to have been associated with Cleopatra's court. The formulas are spicy, earthy, heavy, don't smell like modern floral perfumes at all. They smell dark, musky, almost intimidating. You wouldn't spray them before a date. You'd spray them before walking into a senate you plan to overthrow. It's easy to see how Cleopatra turned that kind of perfume into a declaration of power. And of course, all of this blurred into rumours of witchcraft. Romans, obsessed with branding powerful women as sorceresses, insisted her perfumes were potions, her eyeliner a spell, her milk baths a ritual. The more she leaned into sensory spectacle, the more her enemies whispered, "She doesn't just smell nice, she's casting enchantments." In truth, her science of scent was more chemistry than magic. But in the ancient world, the line between those things was thinner than papyrus. The daily ritual of preparing these cosmetics was probably as strange as the ingredients themselves. Servants grinding malachite for eyeshadow, others mixing honey with vinegar as a face wash, jars of natron salts, piles of crushed herbs, sticky bowls of resin. To step into Cleopatra's morning routine was to walk into a laboratory disguised as a boudoir. Each jar had a purpose, each scent a message, each smear of paint a signal. Think of a modern actor stepping into costume, makeup, lighting. Only Cleopatra's stage was the throne of Egypt, and her audience the entire Mediterranean world. It's worth remembering, too, that cosmetics weren't simply personal in her time, they were political. Every time Cleopatra painted her eyes with kohl, she was echoing centuries of Egyptian queens and goddesses. Every time she perfumed her skin, she was signalling abundance in a land where famine always lurked. Her perfumes weren't about looking pretty for dinner, they were about smelling like prosperity itself. She was crafting an aura you couldn't ignore, and Rome never did. So when you think of Cleopatra's weirdness, don't just picture the asp or the throne. Picture the jars of oils, the crocodile dung sunscreen, the pearl fizzing in vinegar, the milk baths frothing like a luxury spa gone wild. Picture the queen who understood that seduction wasn't only about words or glances, it was about every sense, every detail, every whiff of smoke drifting from a golden censer. And remember, in her world, smelling like power was often more dangerous than wielding a sword. The banquet hall flickers in lamplight, a cavernous chamber where polished bronze mirrors make flames multiply until the walls themselves seem alive with fire. Slaves shuffle past with trays that groan under the weight of food, and the air smells of roasted fish, spiced lamb, and honeyed cakes. If Cleopatra's perfumes were strange enough to shock, her dining table was stranger still. Tonight you sit among the marble pillars and watch as the queen turns meals into theatre, where dishes are not only nourishment but statements of power, wealth, and occasionally pure absurdity. Banquets in Alexandria were already spectacles. Greek nobles imported peacocks to roast whole, their feathers reattached afterward for dramatic effect. Egyptians added their own flair with lotus-shaped bread, Nile fish stuffed with herbs, and honey cakes dripping with syrup. Cleopatra elevated this into performance art. She didn't just host dinners, she staged them. Picture an Instagram influencer who insists on fireworks at brunch. Cleopatra would have nodded approvingly. The weirdest rumour of all is the pearl cocktail, but that's just the headline. The real story is how she used food itself as propaganda. When she entertained Caesar, she knew Rome thought Egypt decadent and soft. So she leaned into the stereotype, offering dishes of such richness that Roman writers later described them with both disgust and envy. Imagine Caesar biting into a stuffed goose liver while simultaneously calculating how much tax revenue he could squeeze from Egyptian farmers. That was the mood, half admiration, half appraisal. Sources hint that Cleopatra's banquets often featured bizarre animals, giraffes, monkeys, and even exotic birds carried across deserts and seas. Guests would marvel, torn between awe and indigestion. The message was clear: if I can ship a giraffe to my dinner table, imagine what I can do to my enemies. Food was her battlefield, and every bite delivered strategy. One strange detail Pliny records: Cleopatra supposedly owned entire fleets just for fishing to supply her banquets. Not fleets of war, mind you, but of fishermen, because nothing screamed "I am richer than you" like offering 20 varieties of Nile fish to your guests. Romans might brag about conquests, but Cleopatra bragged through menu options. Imagine scrolling through Uber Eats and finding a category labelled "Live Crocodile Roasted." That was her flex. Wine was another weapon. Egypt's vineyards weren't famous like Greece's, but Cleopatra compensated by importing amphorae of the finest vintages. She used wine not just for drinking, but for spectacle. The story of her dissolving a pearl in vinegar to win a bet with Mark Antony captures the absurdity. Science nerds point out that dissolving a pearl requires strong acid and time, not just a quick swirl in vinegar. But accuracy didn't matter. The story spread because it symbolized excess. The queen could casually drink away a fortune while her rivals clutched their purses. Rome gossiped, her allies whispered, and Cleopatra smiled. She had won again. Not a meal, but a headline. Her tableware was as much a statement as the food. Gold goblets, silver platters, jewel-encrusted forks. If forks existed in the Roman sense, which was more like prongs. For the Romans, practical eaters with sturdy wooden bowls, Cleopatra's glittering tableware was like dining on the set of a fantasy film. You'd hesitate to even touch the spoon for fear of dropping it. That hesitation was the point. Eating in her presence was supposed to feel intimidating. The sheer scale of these banquets sometimes tipped into the ridiculous. Ancient writers claim one feast cost 10 million sesterces, enough to fund an army campaign. Was that number exaggerated? Absolutely. But exaggeration was part of the myth. Cleopatra didn't mind being accused of excess. She weaponized the accusation. Better to be remembered as a queen who wasted pearls than forgotten as one who counted coins. Her eating habits were rumoured to be as unusual as her feasts. Some claimed she practiced strange diets to preserve her beauty. Small meals of figs, dates, and cucumber mixed with vinegar. Others imagined her fasting before great events so she could make her dramatic eating even more shocking. Whether true or not, the rumours kept her mysterious. Was she the queen who ate sparingly like a philosopher, or the one who gorged like a goddess? The answer, of course, was both. She could present herself as austere in private, then throw a feast so extravagant that Rome couldn't stop gossiping for months. One Roman satirist joked that Cleopatra's meals could bankrupt a province. Another hinted that she trained her guests to expect extravagance, so that ordinary hospitality would seem dull by comparison. Imagine going to a dinner party where the host once served peacock tongues, and the next host offers you plain chicken soup. You'd feel cheated. Cleopatra understood this psychology. She raised the bar so high that rivals could only look inadequate. The weirdness didn't stop with the dishes. Cleopatra staged banquets as theatre. Musicians played, dancers swayed, incense burned, and sometimes philosophers or magicians performed between courses. It wasn't dinner, it was Cirque du Soleil with extra olives. Even the seating was strategic. Friends sat near, rivals further down the table, each place setting a map of favour and suspicion. If Cleopatra laughed at your joke while servants poured spiced wine into your golden cup, you left convinced you were her ally. If she ignored you, the humiliation lingered longer than any sour grapes. Perhaps the strangest part of her banquets is how they blurred pleasure and politics. To Romans, banquets were about excess, but also about showing control. Cleopatra twisted that tradition. She turned dinner into diplomacy. Each dish, each jug of wine, each pearl dissolved into vinegar was a speech without words. Ambassadors went home stuffed with food and even more stuffed with awe. Some, of course, went home muttering that Egypt was decadent, but even that served her purpose. She was unforgettable. Modern historians debate whether some of these stories are propaganda invented by Romans to smear her. Maybe Cleopatra didn't drink pearls or roast giraffes. Maybe her meals weren't as wild as claimed. But here's the thing, even if exaggerated, the rumours themselves reflect her power. No ordinary queen could inspire such stories. Rome had to explain her magnetism somehow, and the easiest way was to claim she fed pearls to her lovers. So as you sit in that lamplit hall, watching servants glide past with trays of honeyed pastries, you realise the weirdest thing about Cleopatra's dining isn't the pearls, the crocodiles, or the peacocks. It's that every bite was theatre, every dish a weapon, every sip of wine another stroke in her portrait as a queen who lived larger than life. You might laugh at the idea of dissolving pearls, but you'd also remember it forever. That was her genius, turning dinner into destiny. The torchlight shifts as you drift from Cleopatra's dining hall toward the docks, where the Nile's waters slap against painted hulls. Imagine the Queen's ship anchored there. Not a simple barge, but a floating theatre of power. The planks gleam with inlaid ivory, sails dyed a royal purple that catches the last glow of the sunset, and ropes perfumed with incense so that even the wind carries her presence. Tonight you don't just see Cleopatra enter a room, you see her arrive on the water like a goddess stepping out of myth. Plutarch, never one to downplay spectacle, tells the story of her first meeting with Mark Antony. She sails upriver in a vessel with silver oars, the rhythm of their strokes timed to music. The sails themselves are soaked in perfume, and the air becomes heavy with sweetness before the ship even rounds the bend. On deck, Cleopatra reclines under a golden canopy dressed as Aphrodite, goddess of love, while young attendants painted as cupids fan her. Crowds gather along the banks, not because they're ordered to, but because curiosity pulls them. It is less a queen's entrance, and more a Broadway debut on water. This wasn't a one-time stunt. Cleopatra had mastered the art of the entrance. She understood what politicians, influencers, and movie stars later discovered. People remember how you show up before they remember what you say. She didn't just walk into a hall, she descended as if from Olympus. Her entrances were timed like a punchline, deliberate, strange, unforgettable. Theatrics like this had roots in Egyptian ritual. Pharaohs were always half human, half divine, appearing in festivals as Horus, Isis, or Osiris reborn. Cleopatra updated the ritual with Greek flair. One moment she was Isis, wearing a crown shaped like a cobra poised to strike. The next she was Aphrodite, shimmering in silk wrapped in gold. She blended pantheons the way a modern DJ blends genres, leaving her audiences dazed. One Roman observer grumbled that she bewitched the people with theatre. He wasn't wrong. Take, for instance, the Feast of the Nile. Traditionally, Egyptians celebrated the river's flood with offerings and music. Cleopatra twisted it into a parade where she appeared on gilded barges, tossing flowers to crowds, musicians playing behind her, dancers leaping on deck. Farmers craned their necks from muddy fields to glimpse her. Children shouted her name as if she were both queen and pop star. The weird part, it worked. Floods might fail, harvests might thin, but Cleopatra gave them something else to believe in. The spectacle of their ruler as both mother and miracle. Even her entrances into private spaces carried theatre. Writers record that she would sometimes arrive to banquets unexpectedly, dressed in dazzling costumes, once as a priestess of Isis, another time in the plain robes of a servant, only to shed them later in dramatic reveal. Imagine playing Guess Who with the Queen, only to discover the servant pouring your wine is the monarch herself. That strangeness kept courtiers off balance, never sure whether to bow, laugh, or faint. The Roman elite loathed this. To them, politics was about grim speeches in the Senate, not scented sails and cupids. When Antony fell under Cleopatra's spell, Roman gossipers blamed her entrances. They said he had been ensnared by the pageantry, as if men could be hypnotized by costumes. Translation. Rome couldn't admit that Cleopatra was simply cleverer than Antony, so they decided she must have tricked him with perfume. But the spectacle wasn't just for seduction. It was for intimidation. When Cleopatra wanted to impress allies, she arrived with overwhelming grandeur. When she wanted to unsettle enemies, she might show up subtly, veiled, silent, letting rumour work harder than presence. Her entrances were weapons in a psychological chess game. Step back, and you realise she had turned arrival itself into politics. Think of how modern leaders choreograph arrivals. The red carpets, the motorcades, the camera flashes. Cleopatra was centuries ahead. Only her stage was larger, her props stranger, and her timing sharper. She understood suspense. She understood lighting. She understood that if you appear from behind a curtain of smoke while dressed as a goddess, no one remembers the dull speech afterward. They remember the goosebumps on their arms. One story says she once met Antony not on a barge but disguised, slipping into his quarters at night dressed in commoner's clothing, shocking him with her boldness. Whether true or not, it highlights the weird unpredictability of her entrances. Sometimes she was thunder and lightning, sometimes she was a whisper in the dark. The key was always surprise. The sensory details mattered most. Perfume saturating the air, the shimmer of gold against torchlight, the rustle of silk. Servants rehearsed every gesture, every timing of oars, every raising of curtains. Cleopatra's court was less a monarchy and more a travelling theatre troupe. Each entrance was a scene in a play, each audience another act, and she was always the star. It is easy to scoff now. Perfumed sails, cupids with feathered wings, a queen lying under a canopy while peasants gawked. Yet ask yourself, if you were there, would you laugh or would you believe? Would you shrug at the theatrics or whisper to your neighbour that you had glimpsed a goddess? That's the weird genius of Cleopatra. She knew disbelief and belief often mingle until you can't separate them. The Romans may have rolled their eyes, but they never forgot. Centuries later, Shakespeare would immortalise Cleopatra's entrances, describing her barge with sails so perfumed that the winds were lovesick with them. Imagine being so theatrical that even poets centuries after your death keep replaying your arrival scenes like blockbuster trailers. And so, as you stand on those Alexandrian docks watching her ship drift by in scented mist, you realise the strangest thing isn't the purple sails, the silver oars, or the costumed attendants. The strangest thing is that Cleopatra turned the simple act of walking, or sailing, into one of the greatest political weapons of her time. She didn't just rule Egypt, she choreographed it. She didn't just enter rooms, she redefined gravity so that every eye, every breath, every heartbeat tilted toward her. That was her true empire. Not just the Nile, not just her armies, but the space she entered, transformed, owned, and left, echoing with her absence. The lamps gutter low, and you drift from the harbour back into Cleopatra's marble corridors, where jewels gleam in alcoves like frozen drops of light. If her entrances were theatre, then her clothing, jewellery, and gestures were the dialogue that followed. Every movement rehearsed, every jewel sharpened into meaning. Cleopatra's wardrobe wasn't just fashion. It was politics stitched in silk, propaganda woven into gold, and sarcasm tucked into embroidery. Tonight you glimpse her preparing for an audience, the quiet fuss of servants braiding hair, polishing emeralds, and choosing which divine persona she'll wear like armour. In Egypt, rulers weren't supposed to be plain. Pharaohs wore crowns shaped like cobras ready to strike, necklaces heavy with gold, and kilts stiffened with pleats that made them look half statue. Cleopatra inherited that tradition, but also updated it. Instead of simply wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, she alternated with Greek robes, diadems, and sheer gowns that blurred cultural lines. Imagine showing up to a state dinner in one half of a Wonder Woman costume and one half of a Jedi robe. Confusing, but you'd never be forgotten. One of her most effective tricks was embodying Isis, the goddess of motherhood, fertility, and magic. She didn't just wear the horns and solar disc crown for religious festivals, she fused it into her daily image. Statues of Cleopatra show her body draped in tight-fitting gowns, with Isis' crown balanced on her head, her face carved serene yet sly. Citizens seeing these images wouldn't just think, "That's our queen." They'd think that's our goddess. To Romans, of course, this was absurd, a queen cosplaying divinity. To Egyptians, it was familiar ritual, except performed with more charisma than any pharaoh had shown in generations. Her gestures were just as calculated. Roman sources, dripping with disdain, noted how she could tilt her head at just the right moment to appear merciful, or raise a hand like a priestess blessing her people. One senator mocked her for acting as if on stage, unaware that was exactly the point. Cleopatra knew she was always on stage. Every bow, every smile, every deliberate silence was part of the performance. Think of it like living life with a constant Instagram filter. Exhausting, but effective. The jewels themselves were strange in their excess. Earrings the size of olives, necklaces so heavy they pressed grooves into her collarbones, bangles that clinked like tiny cymbals when she moved. Each gem wasn't just decoration, it was geography made wearable. Rubies from India, emeralds from Egypt, pearls from the Persian Gulf. To her guests, it was a reminder. My reach stretches farther than your imagination. To Antony or Caesar, it was also a dare. Can your empire shine this brightly on one woman's ears? Perhaps the weirdest rumour about her jewellery was that it sometimes doubled as poison. Stories whisper of hollow rings filled with venom, golden hairpins tipped with toxins, bracelets hiding tiny blades. Was it paranoia or preparation? Either way, the idea of Cleopatra wearing death disguised as beauty added to her mystique. Imagine sitting across the dinner table from someone whose earrings might also be loaded syringes. You'd probably keep your jokes to yourself. Her makeup, too, was theatre. Kohl eyeliner wasn't just for health or glamour. It exaggerated her eyes until they seemed almost supernatural. Pools of black lined with shimmering malachite green. Servants applied rouge made from crushed red ochre, sometimes mixed with clay or seaweed, giving her cheeks a glow that whispered vitality even in dim light. Lips tinted with carmine beetle pigment shimmered red enough to unnerve even stoic senators. Was it unsettling? Absolutely, that was the point. Cleopatra wasn't trying to look pretty in our modern sense. She was trying to look eternal, untouchable, like a statue that had come alive. Roman propaganda predictably twisted this. Writers sneered that she bewitched men with cosmetics, implying she had to paint herself into power. Translation: we can't admit she's smarter than us, so let's claim it's just mascara. Yet the irony is delicious. The same Romans who mocked her eyeliner later spread eyeliner across their empire, turning Cleopatra's weird beauty tricks into everyday fashion. Somewhere in ancient Londinium, a bored Roman wife was smearing kohl across her eyelids without realizing she was copying the very queen her husband had called dangerous. Beyond clothes and makeup, Cleopatra weaponized staging. When she appeared before Caesar wrapped in a carpet, or more likely a linen sack, it wasn't just a quirky entrance, it was a calculated gesture, appearing vulnerable, disarming and theatrical all at once. She transformed a potentially humiliating smuggling trick into a scene of unforgettable intimacy. Imagine unrolling a rug and finding not dust but destiny. Caesar certainly remembered. She also understood colour psychology long before marketers. Gold shimmered like the sun, linking her to Ra. Deep green echoed fertility, life, and Isis's regenerative magic. Purple was imported and rare, a shade that screamed royalty. Even white linen, plain at first glance, was loaded with meaning. Purity, divinity, timeless Egypt. Every colour draped on her body was a paragraph in a political essay. She never wore clothes. She wore arguments. Even her scent joined the performance. Garments were soaked in perfumed oils until the fabric itself exhaled sweetness. Guests swore they could smell Cleopatra before seeing her. Imagine turning a corner in a palace hallway, catching a gust of cinnamon and rose, and knowing without doubt the queen was approaching. She became less a person and more an atmosphere. But the strangest element of all might be her ability to blur sincerity and performance. Was Cleopatra really Isis reborn, or just a clever woman in costume? Was she truly Antony's lover, or simply an actress in a play of empire? Did she bathe in milk for beauty, or because it made Romans gossip? The answer, perhaps, is that she was both, at once genuine and staged, soft and sharp, human and myth. The Romans mocked her for acting. Egyptians worshipped her for embodying divinity. Centuries later, poets romanticized her, and Hollywood gave her eyeliner a budget of millions. But it all goes back to this strange truth. Cleopatra understood performance better than almost anyone in history. She knew that if you control how people see you, you control what they believe about you. So when you imagine Cleopatra standing in her throne room, jeweled diadem catching the lamplight, eyeliner sharp enough to slice, gown shimmering like starlight, remember this. You're not just looking at a queen. You're watching a one-woman show, a masterpiece of politics disguised as beauty, theatre stitched into every seam. And whether you admire her or distrust her, you can't look away. That was her strangest, sharpest trick of all. The torches burn lower as the night deepens, and you drift further into Cleopatra's world. A world where love, or at least what passed for love, was never free from the gravity of politics. You picture her reclining on a couch draped in silk, surrounded by musicians plucking lyres when Julius Caesar first entered her story. Later, it would be Mark Antony who followed the same path, drawn not only to her perfume and wit, but also to the kingdom she represented. And here lies the weirdest truth of all. Cleopatra's famous romances were as much strategies of statecraft as they were matters of the heart. Start with Caesar. Cleopatra was barely in her 20s when the Roman general stormed into Alexandria, a city already buzzing with conflict between her and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. She needed an ally who could crush rivals with a single command. So she performed one of her strangest stunts, sneaking into Caesar's quarters wrapped in a carpet, or perhaps a linen sack. Whether rolled in rug or bundled in cloth, the point was spectacle. She didn't simply request a meeting, she staged an unforgettable scene. The Roman general unrolled what he thought was a gift, only to find a queen lying inside, smiling. Imagine opening your Amazon delivery and discovering a monarch. That was Caesar's version of prime shipping. From that moment, gossip spiraled. To her Egyptian supporters, it was a daring move, proof their queen had charmed Rome's most powerful man. To Romans, it was scandalous. An audacious foreign woman crawling into Caesar's bedchamber. Satirists painted her as a temptress who bewitched him, ignoring the obvious fact. Cleopatra needed Caesar's legions to survive, and Caesar needed Egypt's wealth to fund his ambitions. Love? Maybe. Politics? Absolutely. The affair with Caesar produced a son, Caesarion, whom Cleopatra paraded through Alexandria as proof of her link to Rome's most powerful man. Romans hated this. The idea of Caesar fathering a child with a foreign queen sent shockwaves through the Senate. To them it wasn't romance. It was a nightmare, the possibility of a dynasty that fused Rome and Egypt under Cleopatra's line. The Senate shuddered, and Cleopatra smiled. She had weaponized motherhood itself. After Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra turned her gaze toward Antony. If Caesar was logic and empire, Antony was theatre and chaos, a man who loved luxury almost as much as Cleopatra loved staging it. When she sailed to meet him on that perfumed barge with silver oars and scented sails, she wasn't seducing just a man. She was seducing Rome's eastern commander, the one who could make or break her throne. Antony, ever eager for spectacle, fell headlong into her performance. Their relationship blurred lines between passion and politics until even ancient writers couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Together, they staged themselves as Dionysus and Isis, god and goddess, rulers of a kingdom that stretched beyond geography into myth. Antony dressed in silk, drank from golden goblets, and threw feasts that dwarfed Rome's stern traditions. Cleopatra matched him in extravagance, daring him into contests. Who could spend more? Who could shock more? Who could make the world gasp louder? The pearl in vinegar stunt? That was Cleopatra's move in their ongoing game of one-upmanship. But beneath the luxury, politics pulsed. Cleopatra needed Antony's armies to defend Egypt from rivals and Rome's encroaching grip. Antony needed Cleopatra's wealth to fund his wars. Each kiss was a treaty, each embrace a negotiation. Were they in love? Perhaps. Were they performing love for an audience of allies and enemies alike? Absolutely. Imagine a reality TV couple who also command legions. Cleopatra and Antony were the ancient Mediterranean's power influencers. The weirdest thing about these relationships is how much they terrified Rome. To Romans, a woman in politics was already suspicious. A woman who charmed not one but two of their greatest generals. That was practically witchcraft. Roman poets sneered that she poured poison in their cups, that she cast spells with her eyes, that she enslaved men with her perfumes. Translation: we can't admit our heroes fell willingly, so let's blame magic mascara. Roman propaganda twisted her into a caricature, a femme fatale who corrupted noble men. In truth, Cleopatra was simply playing the game better than most. She understood that in a world ruled by men with swords, her sharpest blade was her ability to turn intimacy into alliance. If that meant gossiping senators spat venom in scrolls, so be it. Better venom on papyrus than daggers in her back. Still, the human side of these relationships peeks through the smoke. Cleopatra bore children with Antony, twins, and later another son. She wasn't just staging scenes, she was building a dynasty, a strange fusion of Greek, Egyptian, and Roman bloodlines. Their palace life was said to be indulgent, full of wine, laughter, and games, a weird bubble of luxury while the rest of the Mediterranean simmered with war. One anecdote claims they would dress as servants and wander Alexandria's streets, playing tricks on commoners, laughing like reckless lovers. Was it true? Who knows? But even the rumour suggests that Cleopatra's strangeness extended to living both as goddess on a throne and prankster in the alleys. Antony's downfall became Cleopatra's downfall. Rome's Senate, whipped into fury by Octavian, declared war not just on Antony, but on Cleopatra herself. The propaganda machine doubled down. She was a harlot queen, a serpent, a corrupter. But pause and notice the weird inversion. Rome wasn't declaring war on Antony alone, one of their own generals. They were declaring war on a foreign queen. Cleopatra had become so entangled with Antony, so symbolically threatening, that Rome recast the conflict as a war of civilizations. Here's the irony. The very thing Romans mocked her for, using love as politics, made her one of the most effective rulers of her dynasty. She kept Egypt independent longer than anyone expected. She outmaneuvered rivals, secured alliances, and made herself unforgettable. If Antony hadn't lost at Actium, perhaps history would remember her less as a seductress and more as a stateswoman. But history loves strange stories, and Cleopatra gave them plenty. So as you stand in that silken chamber, watching her raise a goblet of wine to Antony, while musicians strum and dancers whirl, remember, you're not just watching lovers, you're watching generals negotiate treaties with glances, a queen secure her throne with kisses, an empire tremble at the idea that power might lie not in swords, but in scented whispers. The weirdest thing about Cleopatra's romances isn't that they happened, it's that they worked, at least for a while. The lamps in the banquet hall sputter, smoke curling toward the ceiling like gossip rising into the rafters, and you notice something. Cleopatra's enemies were not only across the seas in Rome, or crouching in dark alleys in Alexandria, they were everywhere whispering. If perfume and pearls were her weapons, then rumour was the battlefield where Rome struck back hardest. Tonight you drift into the world of ancient propaganda, where Cleopatra's reputation was shredded, stitched, and twisted until she became less woman than monster in Roman imagination. The gossip machine of Rome was relentless. Senators who had never seen Cleopatra described her as a sorceress who bound men with potions. Poets painted her as a seductress riding crocodiles into battle. Politicians spat her name in speeches as shorthand for decadence and danger. To Rome, she was the perfect scapegoat. Foreign, female, fabulously rich, and uncomfortably successful at bending their heroes to her side. Why blame Antony for his failures when you could blame Cleopatra's mascara? It's the ancient equivalent of saying, he didn't lose the war, his girlfriend distracted him. Cicero, the crankiest lawyer in Roman history, practically foamed at the mouth whenever her name came up. He grumbled in letters about her arrogance, her insolence, and how she dared to act like an equal in conversation. Translation: she spoke Latin better than me, and I hate it. Other Roman writers doubled down. Horace, Propertius and Virgil all spun Cleopatra into poetry, not as a queen struggling to save her kingdom, but as a foreign witch queen who dared challenge Rome's masculine order. She was described as a fatal monster, the shame of the Nile, a woman drunk with power. Imagine a smear campaign where every newspaper, podcast and late-night comedian repeats your name until it becomes a punchline. That was Cleopatra's PR nightmare. The weirdest part is how Romans couldn't agree on the details of her supposed monstrosity. Some claimed she was irresistibly beautiful, others sneered that she wasn't pretty at all but relied on charm and wit. Some swore she was delicate and enchanting, others painted her as a domineering puppet master. In trying to destroy her, Roman writers revealed more about their own fears than about Cleopatra herself. She became a mirror where Rome projected every anxiety about foreign influence, female power, and the possibility that their empire wasn't as invincible as they thought. Take the crocodile rumour. One Roman satirist suggested she tamed and rode crocodiles, a bizarre image that stuck. To Egyptians, crocodiles were sacred to Sobek, a god of fertility and strength. To Romans, they were terrifying swamp beasts. By claiming Cleopatra sat astride them, the propagandists weren't trying to be accurate. They were trying to make her seem unnatural, freakish, part animal. Yet the image is so strange it almost makes you want it to be true. Picture Cleopatra, eyeliner sharp enough to cut marble, gliding down the Nile on a crocodile chariot like some unhinged Disney villain. Rome spread it as insult. Centuries later, it reads like a heavy metal album cover. Another smear was the idea that she enslaved men with drugs. Writers insisted she poured love potions into Antony's wine, that her lips were laced with enchantments. Of course, the only drug she used was charisma, intelligence, and political savvy. But in a culture where women were expected to sit quietly in the corner while men made speeches, a woman who talked back fluently in 5 languages had to be explained away. The explanation? Witchcraft. Even Octavian, the future Augustus, exploited this propaganda masterfully. When he clashed with Antony, he didn't frame it as a civil war between 2 Roman generals. He framed it as Rome versus Cleopatra, civilization versus barbarism, masculine discipline versus feminine corruption. His soldiers weren't fighting Antony, they were saving Rome from Cleopatra's perfume-scented empire. It was genius. It turned Roman anxieties into motivation, and it worked. Antony lost support, and Cleopatra became the villain in a war that was never really hers alone. The strangeness of this smear campaign lies in its effectiveness. Cleopatra was brilliant, multilingual, and politically shrewd, yet much of history remembered her through the filter of Roman gossip. Even centuries later, Shakespeare's Cleopatra is the seductress, the manipulator, the drama queen, not the strategist who kept Egypt independent in the shadow of Rome. The propaganda outlived the empire that created it. It's like if the only surviving news articles about you came from your bitterest ex, and they became required reading for 2,000 years. Still, Cleopatra wasn't naive about the power of gossip. She knew rumour could be as sharp as any sword, so she occasionally leaned into it. If Rome wanted to believe she was Isis, goddess of magic, she performed Isis more boldly. If they muttered that she was too decadent, she staged feasts that made them choke on their own envy. She turned their insults into branding. You think I'm excessive? Watch me dissolve a pearl in vinegar. You think I'm a witch? Watch me arrive on a perfumed barge as Aphrodite herself. It was PR judo, flipping the weight of gossip back onto her enemies. And yet, the gossip left scars. Imagine walking through your palace knowing that across the sea, entire Senate sessions are dedicated to mocking you. That poets you've never met are inventing rumours about your bedchamber. That the world's greatest empire has declared you its official villain. You'd laugh, perhaps, but late at night, pacing marble floors, the whispers must have sounded louder than the crickets outside. The weird irony is that Roman gossip meant to diminish her, ultimately immortalised her. Without those satirical poems, those venomous speeches, We might not even remember Cleopatra so vividly. The gossip painted her larger than life, and once myth swallows history, the details hardly matter. Was she really beautiful? Did she actually bathe in donkey milk? Did she ride crocodiles or enchant generals with mascara? By the time the rumours had spread, it didn't matter. She was no longer just a queen. She was a legend. So as you drift through that smoky banquet hall, hearing the crackle of oil lamps and the hiss of whispered jokes, remember, Cleopatra's strangest legacy isn't just her jewels, perfumes, or love affairs. It's that the gossip machine designed to bury her ended up preserving her. Rome thought they were writing her downfall. Instead, they wrote her immortality. The palace feels quieter now, shadows pooling like ink in the corners, and you find yourself standing before a chest, filled not with silks or gold, but with jars, powders, and tiny vials sealed in wax. Here lies Cleopatra's strangest arsenal. Cosmetics that doubled as cures, poisons that masqueraded as beauty, and experiments that blurred the line between medicine and menace. Tonight you peek into her laboratory of seduction and survival, where every smear of eyeliner could be healthcare and every jewel-tipped comb might hide a fatal sting. Start with the basics. Kohl eyeliner. Cleopatra's dark-lined eyes remain iconic, and for good reason. But the recipe was far weirder than modern mascara. Ancient kohl was ground from galena, a lead-based mineral mixed with oils and resins until it smeared into a glossy black paste. Strangely, instead of poisoning its users, small doses of lead salts actually stimulated the production of nitric oxide in the skin, which boosted immunity against eye infections. Translation: Cleopatra's makeup wasn't just glam, it was ancient antibiotic eyeliner. Try explaining that to your dermatologist. Yes, doctor, I smear crushed rocks on my eyelids because it kills bacteria and terrifies my enemies. Then there was malachite, a shimmering green mineral she used for eyeshadow. Ground into powder and blended with animal fat, it glowed like verdant Nile reeds under lamplight. Romans mocked this painted witchcraft, but Egyptians believed the green pigment protected against evil spirits. Cleopatra's choice wasn't vanity alone, it was spiritual insurance, a portable shield against misfortune. To Romans, it was clown makeup. To Egyptians, it was sacred war paint. Cosmetics in Cleopatra's hands weren't neutral. They were layered symbols. Red ochre tinted her lips, crushed beetles and seaweed blended into rouge, and scented oils soaked into her skin, until her very presence smelled like a temple offering. Imagine hugging someone and leaving their robes scented for days afterward. Her aura lingered even when she didn't. It wasn't just fashion, it was psychological warfare. But Cleopatra's experiments weren't limited to beautification. She dabbled in pharmacology, testing poisons the way some monarchs test wine. Ancient sources suggest she studied venom from snakes, scorpions, and spiders, experimenting on condemned prisoners to see which toxins killed swiftly and which caused agonizing deaths. It sounds horrifying, but in her mind it was pragmatic. If you're a queen surrounded by rivals, you want to know your exit strategies. She reportedly concluded that ASP venom, though dramatic, might not be the swiftest, preferring poisons that cause numbness before death. Imagine the dinner conversation. Pass the figs, and by the way, this week's snake trials were promising. Roman gossip exaggerated this into witchcraft. They claimed she brewed love potions, cursed enemies with powders, and smeared her lips with toxins to ensnare men with fatal kisses. Did she really? Probably not, but she encouraged the rumours, because what's scarier than a queen who might kiss you into oblivion? It was myth as defence. Better her enemies whisper nervously than attack confidently. Even her jewellery may have doubled as weaponry. Stories tell of rings with hollow compartments for poison, hairpins tipped with venom, and golden combs that could prick like daggers. Whether or not these were real, the idea stuck. Cleopatra became the woman whose beauty wasn't just dazzling but dangerous. If her earrings jingled, you had to wonder, were they diamonds or death capsules? Cleopatra's obsession with control over her body extended into medicine too. She studied texts from both Greek and Egyptian traditions, blending Hippocratic remedies with Nile herbalism. Aloe, honey, vinegar, natron salts. These were her skincare before Sephora. Honey healed wounds, vinegar tightened skin, natron cleansed, aloe soothed. To modernise, her cabinet looks like a cross between a chemist's bench and a wellness influencer's kitchen counter. The weird part is how much of it actually worked. Honey really is antibacterial. Aloe really does soothe burns. Cleopatra wasn't just smearing random swamp sludge on her face. She was practicing a kind of proto-science. But where she really strayed into the bizarre was in her pursuit of immortality through alchemy. Sources hint that she consulted magicians and philosophers about concoctions to preserve youth. Recipes of crushed pearls, rare herbs, and even ground gold appear in the lore. Did they work? Absolutely not. But the symbolism mattered. Drinking dissolved pearls wasn't about nutrition. It was about telling the world that beauty itself bent to her will. And yet, behind the glitter and potions, you sense a darker truth. Cleopatra lived in a world where women's power was precarious. Cosmetics were not vanity. They were armour. Perfumes masked the smell of fear. Poisons in rings reminded rivals she wasn't defenceless. Experiments on venoms may sound cruel, but for a queen surrounded by betrayal, knowledge of death was survival. Strange? Yes, but necessary. The Romans never stopped sneering. They accused her of drowning herself in makeup, of enslaving generals with potions, of disguising ugliness with tricks. But beneath their mockery was fear. They couldn't fathom a woman turning cosmetics into strategy, medicine into spectacle, perfume into politics, so they called it witchcraft. And perhaps Cleopatra laughed. Perhaps she leaned into her mirror, coal brush poised, and whispered, "If mascara makes you tremble, wait until you see what I do with armies." Then she walked into the throne room, eyeliner sharp enough to draw blood, perfume clouding the air like incense, and smiled as her enemies squirmed. That was the weirdest truth of all. Cleopatra's beauty wasn't an accident of birth. It was an invention, crafted daily from powders, oils, venoms, and theatre. A mask, a shield, a crown painted onto skin. Behind it was a strategist who knew that in a world ruled by swords, sometimes the deadliest weapon was a jar of eyeliner. The palace grows quieter as night deepens, and you wander toward the inner courtyards where strange rituals once played out beneath moonlight. Cleopatra was not content to rule as a mortal monarch. She wrapped herself in ceremonies that seemed half sacred, half absurd, rituals that blurred the edges of religion, superstition, and politics. Tonight you step into that twilight zone of the Egyptian court, where incense clouds the air, where priests chant in hieroglyphs, and where the queen herself claims not just to lead her people, but to embody their gods. Egyptian royalty had always been a little odd by modern standards. Pharaohs were not just kings. They were Horus on earth, sons of Ra, walking embodiments of cosmic order. Festivals reinforced this with elaborate pageants. Processions carried statues of gods along the Nile. Priests muttered spells over animals, and offerings of beer, bread and onions piled high before shrines. Cleopatra inherited all this, but decided it wasn't enough. She dialed it up. Where her Macedonian ancestors had kept themselves aloof, content to nod politely at Egyptian rites while sipping Greek wine, Cleopatra stepped directly into the role of goddess. In the great festival of Isis, she didn't simply sponsor the ceremonies, she starred in them. Picture her robed in white linen, golden horns crowning her head, stepping barefoot across temple stone still warm from the sun. The crowd kneels, the air heavy with incense, and Cleopatra raises her arms as priests chant. To her subjects, she's no longer merely Cleopatra VII. She's Isis, reborn, mother of the people, guardian of the Nile's flood. It was theatre, but theatre with divine stakes. Anyone doubting her power now had to doubt the goddess herself, a dangerous line to cross. Her rituals extended beyond festivals. Ancient writers claim she embraced unusual superstitions, charms against the evil eye, spells to ensure fertility, blessings for the annual Nile flood. At times she participated in animal rituals that would have shocked her Greek ancestors. Apis bulls, crocodiles sacred to Sobek, and falcons sacred to Horus were paraded before her. She blessed them, fed them, and sometimes sacrificed smaller animals in ceremonies linking her reign to cosmic order. Romans, hearing of this, scoffed, "She pets crocodiles while pretending to be a goddess." Egyptians, meanwhile, saw it as proof their queen was intimately bound to the divine forces that fed their crops. One peculiar custom was her blending of Greek and Egyptian rituals. In some ceremonies she appeared as Isis, in others as Aphrodite. Sometimes she fused them, standing on temple steps crowned both with the solar disk of Isis and the girdle of the Greek goddess of love. To outsiders it looked ridiculous, a costume party gone wrong. To Cleopatra it was brilliant branding. By embodying both pantheons she made herself legible to everyone, Greek nobles, Egyptian farmers and Roman envoys alike. Her court too was steeped in strange rituals. Courtiers were expected to bow, not just to the queen but to her divine persona. Visitors might be required to sprinkle incense, pour libations or recite oaths in her presence. Some Roman envoys found themselves trapped in ceremonies that felt uncomfortably close to worship, forced to bow before a mortal woman while pretending it was simple courtesy. Imagine a senator trained in Roman stoicism, forced to sprinkle incense at Cleopatra's feet while she gazed down like a goddess. You can almost hear his teeth grinding. Rituals of the body fascinated her as well. Some sources suggest she believed certain baths or ointments could absorb divine energy. Milk baths, strange enough on their own, became more than skincare. They were framed as symbolic rebirth, immersing the queen in purity before emerging renewed. Perfumed oils rubbed on her skin were not just luxuries. They were offerings she carried upon her body, transforming herself into a living temple. Every whiff of cinnamon and myrrh declared, "I am not merely a woman, I am sacred." The rituals could be unsettling, even eerie. During certain processions, statues of gods were paraded alongside Cleopatra herself, as if the divine and the human walked hand in hand. Drums thundered, priests swung censers, crowds chanted hymns, and there she was, living flesh among stone deities. To the people it erased the line between queen and goddess. To Rome it looked like blasphemy and megalomania. But Cleopatra understood that belief, once woven into ritual, becomes harder to question. If you watched your queen process beside Isis's statue every year, eventually you stopped separating them. Superstitions also bled into her daily decisions. Astrologers played prominent roles in her court, casting horoscopes before battles, treaties, and even pregnancies. One tale says she once delayed a meeting with envoys because the stars weren't aligned for speaking with foreigners. To skeptics, that sounds absurd. Astrology as foreign policy. To her, it was weaving the cosmos itself into her authority. Rome had omens and augurs. Cleopatra had constellations and lunar charts. Even her approach to death tied into ritual. Ancient stories claim she tested poisons on condemned prisoners not only for practicality, but also as ritual exploration, seeking the cleanest way to cross into the afterlife. It sounds macabre, but in Egyptian thought, the manner of death influenced the soul's passage. Cleopatra's obsession with this was less cruelty than control, ensuring that even her end would be staged like a ritual, a performance for gods and mortals alike. One of the strangest accounts describes her involvement in magical rites to ensure fertility and harvests. Priests would mix seeds with blood, burying them in temple gardens while chanting spells. Cleopatra presided, her hands scattering the soil, her voice murmuring prayers. Was it science? Was it magic? It was both, and neither. In her mind, it was governance, ensuring the Nile's bounty through ritual just as much as through irrigation. The weirdest irony is that while Romans mocked these rituals as exotic nonsense, they themselves were steeped in augury, omens, and sacrifices. But in their propaganda, Cleopatra's rituals became sorcery, while their own were tradition. Double standards sharpened like daggers. So you stand there in that courtyard, hearing the echo of drums, seeing torches flare against statues, watching Cleopatra glide forward with cobra crown gleaming. The rituals may look bizarre, even theatrical, but they served a purpose. They made her more than mortal, harder to overthrow, impossible to forget. Strange or not, they bound Egypt to her as tightly as chains, not of iron, but of incense and imagination. The halls echo faintly with the shuffle of servants carrying baskets, not of bread or figs, but of gleaming treasures, coins stacked high, bolts of silk shimmering like water, amphorae filled with oils so fragrant the scent leaks through the clay. If Cleopatra was mistress of ritual and performance, she was equally master of wealth. Tonight, you trail her footsteps through chambers where gifts were piled higher than statues, and where Egypt's riches weren't just hoarded but weaponized. Treasures in her hands were not inert. They were stories, bribes, rewards, and sometimes jokes disguised as presents. Egypt was absurdly wealthy by ancient standards. The Nile's annual flood made its soil a breadbasket, and its harvest filled granaries that fed not just Alexandria but Rome itself. Cleopatra knew grain was more valuable than gold. A delayed shipment could starve half a city, and so she wielded wheat like a scepter. When Rome tried to pressure her, she tightened grain exports. When she wanted favour, she opened the granaries. Picture being able to blackmail an empire with bread. Cleopatra could. Yet she didn't limit herself to the predictable. She showered allies with gifts that bordered on the bizarre. Mark Antony received not only treasure chests but exotic animals. Giraffes stretching their necks in Roman arenas, monkeys dressed in ribbons, lions that roared through palace halls. The Romans loved spectacle, and Cleopatra fed them animals as if she were stocking a carnival. Exotic creatures became her ambassadors, each one whispering of Egypt's power. Imagine a general trying to look serious while a ribbon-wearing baboon capers behind him. That was Cleopatra's subtle joke on Rome. Pearls were another favourite, and not just the infamous one dissolved in vinegar. She gave Antony strings of pearls so large and lustrous they were said to blind onlookers. Pearls were rarer than diamonds then, worth kingdoms. Cleopatra treated them as casual accessories, as if to say, "What you consider priceless, I consider Tuesday." The message was clear. Rome might have legions, but Cleopatra had wealth that made legions kneel. Even odder were her experiments in lavish banquets staged as economic theatre. One story says she gifted Antony entire feasts worth fortunes, then threw leftovers to commoners in Alexandria as though scattering breadcrumbs. To the hungry, it was generosity. To Antony, it was extravagance. To Cleopatra, it was strategy, turning dinner into diplomacy twice over, first to impress, then to buy loyalty. Her palace itself was part of her treasure chest. Floors of polished alabaster reflected torchlight. Columns inlaid with lapis lazuli shimmered blue as the Nile. Every guest who stepped inside walked into wealth incarnate. Yet Cleopatra was not just flaunting, she was curating. The architecture whispered that Egypt had been rich long before Rome dreamed of the empire, that her throne rested on millennia of stored abundance. Romans could conquer Gaul, but they couldn't conjure pyramids. One peculiar gift she gave Antony was a library of scrolls, not just Homer and Plato, but obscure Egyptian texts, hymns to gods, instructions for embalming, fragments of alchemy. It was wealth of another kind, knowledge. To Antony, perhaps, it looked like intellectual curiosity. To Cleopatra, it was branding. Rome may have soldiers, but I have secrets. And secrets, once wrapped in papyrus, last longer than armies. Tributes from allies often came in equally strange forms. Nubian kings sent elephants. Indian merchants sent spices. Arabian envoys arrived with incense so rare its smoke was said to heal coughs. Cleopatra accepted them all, weaving them into her court performances. A Nubian elephant paraded beside her throne wasn't just decoration. It was proof of alliances stretching beyond Rome's reach. An Arabian incense burner perfuming her banquets wasn't just fragrance. It was a statement that Egypt's queen commanded trade routes wider than oceans. Her use of wealth could be playful, even mocking. Pliny records a tale where Antony tried to impress Cleopatra with lavish gifts. She smiled, then casually pointed to her jewellery box, claiming its contents alone outweighed his offerings. Imagine trying to impress someone with a sports car only to have them say, "That's cute, I have 6 in my garage." Cleopatra turned generosity into one-upmanship, each gift a challenge. But wealth in her court was also ritualized. Offerings to gods weren't modest bowls of fruit, they were mountains of bread, amphorae of wine, statues coated in gold leaf. During festivals, treasures glittered so brightly under the sun that crowds squinted. To Romans, this was gaudy waste. To Egyptians, it was divine necessity, proof their queen could please the gods. Cleopatra leaned into this strangeness because every dazzling ritual doubled as propaganda. Her treasury, though vast, was always under pressure. Egypt owed debts to Rome, and Cleopatra's extravagance often doubled as negotiation. By dazzling Antony with treasures, she secured his political support. By sending Roman senators gold and grain, she bought silence or loyalty. It was bribery disguised as generosity. But wasn't all politics bribery disguised as something else? Cleopatra just happened to do it with pearls and giraffes. The weirdest treasures, though, weren't gold or jewels, but living beings. Accounts hint that Cleopatra gifted trained dancers, musicians, even dwarfs and acrobats as presents to foreign courts. It sounds grotesque to modern ears, but in her world, sending a troupe of entertainers was like sending an embassy of joy. Gifts carried meaning. Here is laughter, here is music, here is proof that Egypt's abundance flows even into human talent. Hooray. She understood that wealth wasn't only measured in metal, it was measured in spectacle. Rome predictably twisted these gifts into ridicule. Poets scoffed that Antony was Cleopatra's pet, fattened on pearls and monkeys. Senators muttered that she wasted fortunes to corrupt men. Yet the irony was thick. Every time Romans mocked her extravagance, they spread her legend. "Cleopatra drinks pearls," they sneered, and suddenly everyone in Rome pictured her doing exactly that. Gossip became advertisement, and Cleopatra smiled from afar. In the end, her strangest use of wealth wasn't in what she kept, but in what she destroyed. By dissolving pearls, by giving away animals, by scattering feasts, she showed that true power wasn't possession, but the ability to discard. Anyone can hoard treasure. Only Cleopatra could annihilate it without blinking. It was wealth as theatre, wealth as intimidation, wealth as myth. So as you stand in her treasury, gazing at piles of jewels and hearing the faint roar of a lion gifted from Nubia, you realise the oddest truth. Cleopatra's riches were never just riches. They were stories sharpened into weapons. A pearl wasn't a gem, it was a headline. A giraffe wasn't an animal, it was a walking map of her influence. A feast wasn't food, it was politics plated in gold. And maybe that's the strangest treasure of all, not the jewels themselves, but Cleopatra's ability to turn them into immortality. The corridors darken as you drift toward a chamber filled with murmurs of grief, the clink of goblets gone silent, and the heavy air of inevitability. Cleopatra's story, so full of theatre and spectacle, slides now into its most dramatic act, the endgame with Antony. Tonight you stand in the shadows of battle tents and palace balconies, watching two lovers fight not only for themselves but for entire kingdoms, and watching how even their downfall became one last, weird, unforgettable performance. Mark Antony and Cleopatra were a spectacle long before their war with Octavian erupted. They paraded themselves as Dionysus and Isis, god and goddess, showering the world with feasts, gold, and daring imagery. But Rome grew restless. Octavian, cold and calculating, framed the conflict not as Antony's betrayal, but as Rome versus Cleopatra. Civilization against decadence. The propaganda stuck. Senators fumed that Antony had become her puppet. Pamphlets whispered that Cleopatra was preparing to invade Rome with armies of eunuchs and crocodiles. The stage was set for Actium, the great naval battle in 31 BCE. Imagine it. Cleopatra's fleet gleaming on the Ionian Sea, sails dyed purple, oars flashing like silver fish. Antony commands one side, Octavian the other. Cleopatra herself is present, not cloistered in a palace but aboard her flagship. This alone was strange enough. Roman women rarely even attended war councils, let alone naval battles. Cleopatra's presence electrified allies and infuriated enemies. Yet when the tide turned, when Octavian's strategy pressed hard, Cleopatra's ship suddenly raised sail and fled. Antony, stunned, abandoned his command to follow her. Historians debate why. Was it panic? Was it prearranged strategy? Was it raw fear? Whatever the reason, their fleets dissolved into chaos. Rome later sneered that Cleopatra had bewitched Antony into cowardice. Translation: we can't admit Octavian was clever, so let's blame perfume again. After Actium, the world shrank around them. Back in Alexandria, the glittering palace still shone with gold, but now it was a gilded cage. Octavian's forces advanced, allies melted away, and the couple turned their lives into theatre. Plutarch tells us they formed a society called the Inimitable Livers, dedicated to feasting, joking, and extravagant play. If they were doomed, they decided, they would fall laughing, goblets raised. It's a strange, almost surreal image. Two rulers throwing costume parties as their empires collapsed outside. Imagine hosting a karaoke night while foreclosure notices pile at the door. Cleopatra and Antony seemed determined to face doom with irony. But the tension grew heavier. Antony, humiliated by Actium, grew erratic. Cleopatra, calculating as ever, prepared contingencies. She secured her treasury in hidden vaults, tested poisons on prisoners to find the swiftest death, and even sent envoys to negotiate with Octavian behind Antony's back. The weirdest detail. At one point she may have considered handing Antony over alive if it secured Egypt's survival. That's the cold edge of Cleopatra often forgotten. Beneath the theatrics she was pragmatic, even ruthless. When Octavian's armies finally surrounded Alexandria, Antony tried one last stand. He fought valiantly, but the city fell. Rumours reached him that Cleopatra was dead, a false report, perhaps planted, perhaps misunderstood. Broken, Antony fell on his sword, but he didn't die immediately. Instead, bleeding, he demanded to be carried to Cleopatra's mausoleum, where she had barricaded herself with treasures and attendants. Soldiers hoisted him up, and he was pulled through a window to die in her arms. The scene is grotesque, operatic, and strangely tender. Two lovers trapped by politics, cradling each other amid incense and jewels, while Rome hammered at the gates. Cleopatra now faced Octavian alone. She tried every trick, sending envoys, offering treasures, even meeting him face to face. Some sources suggest she tried to seduce him, as she had Caesar and Antony. Octavian, however, was made of colder stone. He refused her charms, calculating that she alive in Rome would be a living trophy. He wanted to drag her in chains through his triumph, paraded before jeering crowds as the ultimate symbol of Rome's victory over decadence. Cleopatra understood the humiliation awaiting her, and here her strangest performance began. She retreated into her mausoleum, dressed in her finest robes, adorned with jewels, lying on a golden couch as if already a goddess awaiting worship. Around her were piled treasures, as if she intended to vanish into the afterlife surrounded by wealth. She had studied death carefully, the poisons, the venoms, the rituals. And when the time came, she chose her ending not as victim but as author. Tradition says she arranged for a basket of figs to be delivered, inside of which was concealed an asp, the venomous snake sacred to Egypt. She let it bite her, choosing death by symbol, the serpent of Isis, the emblem of pharaohs striking her into eternity. Was it really an asp? Scholars debate. Some think it was poison hidden in a comb or ointment. Others argue it was a concoction she swallowed. The truth hardly matters. What matters is the myth she crafted. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, choosing death in a way that fused politics, theatre, and religion. She didn't let Octavian stage her as defeated queen. She staged herself as goddess returning to the divine. Her death was strange not only in method but in timing. She died as Octavian entered, robbing him of his living trophy. His triumph in Rome carried her image but not her body. He paraded effigies instead, wax figures of Cleopatra with an asp clinging to her arm, and though meant as humiliation, it immortalized her. The Romans wanted her remembered as monster. Instead, she became myth. The weirdest irony is that Antony and Cleopatra, mocked as reckless lovers, left behind a story more enduring than Octavian's own victories. Augustus ruled Rome for decades, building peace and empire, but in whispers and plays it was Cleopatra and Antony people remembered. The queen who staged her death, the general who fell for her, the lovers who turned downfall into theatre. So as you stand in that mausoleum's shadow, the scent of figs clinging to the air, the gold glinting faintly in lamplight, you realise Cleopatra's strangest legacy wasn't that she died by snakebite or poison. It was that she made death itself a performance, one last deliberate entrance, not into a banquet hall or on a perfumed barge, but into legend. The air feels heavy in the silence after Cleopatra's death, as if the walls themselves are still trying to process the drama they just witnessed. Octavian has her treasures seized, her body buried, her children parcelled out like spoils of war, and yet, as the dust of conquest settles, something strange begins to happen. The story of her death becomes even larger than her life. The asp slithers into legend, wax effigies are paraded through Rome, and gossip mutates into mythology. Tonight, you wander into that hazy space between fact and fable, where Cleopatra's end is retold so many times that truth itself slips through the cracks like incense smoke. The snake, or was it? Roman writers loved the image of the asp curled against Cleopatra's pale arm, fangs sinking gently into her flesh as she reclined like a goddess at rest. The symbolism was irresistible, a serpent, sacred to Egyptian deities, ushering her into the afterlife. But even in antiquity, people doubted it. How does one sneak a live snake into a mausoleum without attracting suspicion? How does one coax it to bite at the perfect moment? Skeptics suggested she used a poisoned ointment hidden in a hair comb, or a hollowed-out needle tipped with venom. Others swore it was a vial of toxic herbs swallowed in wine. The details blurred, but the story stuck. Why? Because the image of the queen and the snake was too strange, too poetic, too unforgettable to abandon. Octavian himself leaned into the myth. By parading effigies of Cleopatra with a snake clinging to her arm, he ensured that the asp became her eternal companion. Was it historical accuracy? Absolutely not. It was propaganda disguised as theatre, but it worked. People remembered not Octavian's careful strategy or his political reforms. They remembered Cleopatra, eyeliner sharp as daggers, dying with a serpent as her crown. What's weirder is how the story kept evolving. Later medieval chroniclers embroidered the tale with new details. Cleopatra hiding venom in golden combs, Cleopatra testing poisons on condemned prisoners before choosing the asp, Cleopatra whispering spells as the snake struck. By the Renaissance, painters embraced the melodrama, Cleopatra half nude, reclining on silk, asp pressed dramatically to her breast, as if death were not tragedy but erotic theatre. Hollywood followed centuries later, giving Elizabeth Taylor shimmering robes and a pet cobra practically ready for its own credit line. And through it all, the Aspie became more famous than Cleopatra's armies, treasures or policies. Think of it, the last pharaoh of Egypt, remembered less for ruling a kingdom than for choosing a prop in her final act. It's absurd and eerie, but it proves Cleopatra's genius one last time. She knew spectacle outlives statistics. No one remembers the tax reforms of her reign, but everyone remembers the snake. The fascination with her death also revealed how uncomfortable Romans were with the idea of her defiance. Octavian wanted her alive, paraded in chains through Rome as a symbol of submission. Instead, she staged her own ending. In Roman logic, this was almost worse than rebellion. She denied Octavian the final word, denied him the chance to humiliate her. That's why they spread stories of witchcraft and poison, to reclaim control over the narrative. If Cleopatra killed herself with a snake, they could frame it as cowardice or sorcery. What they couldn't admit was that she had outmaneuvered Octavian even in dying. The weirdest part. Her method of death became a cultural obsession. Romans carved little amulets of snakes, invoking Cleopatra's myth. Poets kept retelling the scene, each time adding new flourishes. Even centuries later, Arab historians debated whether the snake tale was real or invented. Everyone wanted to solve the riddle, as if her death were a puzzle box that refused to stay shut. Modern science has tried too. Scholars debate which snake could have been used: an asp, a cobra, a viper. Some argue the venom wouldn't have killed quickly enough. Others point out that multiple bites might have been required. But again, accuracy misses the point. Cleopatra's death was never meant to be a medical case study. It was meant to be theatre. And in that, she succeeded beyond measure. Her attendants too joined the performance. Two of her closest maids, Charmian and Nereus, reportedly chose to die alongside her, arranging her robes and crown even as they themselves collapsed from poison. When Octavian soldiers burst in, Charmian was said to still be adjusting Cleopatra's crown. "Was this well done of your lady?" one soldier asked. "Yes," Charmian replied, before dying. "It was well done, and fitting for a descendant of kings." Whether or not those words were real, they became immortal. Even her servants turned death into drama. The story didn't end with her body. Octavian had her buried beside Antony, allowing their myth to rest together. But he also had Caesarion, her son by scissor, executed. The boy was too dangerous, a living reminder that Cleopatra had once dreamed of fusing Egypt and Rome. Her other children by Antony were dragged to Rome, paraded through the streets as captives. Cleopatra was gone, but her presence lingered in the humiliation of her offspring, reminders that Rome's victory was never clean. And yet, the legend refused to die. Romans thought they had destroyed Cleopatra by mocking her. Instead, they preserved her. Every sneer, every effigy, every poem describing her as Serpent Queen made her memory sharper. Octavian became Augustus, first emperor of Rome, but to this day, most people can name Cleopatra before they name him. That's her strangest triumph. The woman Rome tried to erase became more famous than the man who ruled it. So as you stand in the mausoleum's fading torchlight, the imagined hiss of a snake curling at the edge of hearing, you realise that Cleopatra's death was not a conclusion, but a performance so strange and powerful that it swallowed history whole. Whether by asp, comb or cup, she wrote her own ending, and the world never stopped retelling it. The torches burn low, and the Nile outside seems to sigh as if even the river knows the story has shifted. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, no longer walks the palace halls, yet strangely her footsteps echo louder after her death than before. Tonight you drift through centuries like a ghost, watching as Cleopatra is reborn again and again, not in temples or tombs, but in myths, plays, and paintings that reimagine her as everything from demon to muse. Death didn't silence her, it multiplied her into 1,000 faces. The Romans began it, of course. Octavian paraded effigies of her through his triumph, showing wax figures of Cleopatra with a snake coiled to her arm, a grotesque reminder to crowds who had never seen her alive. To Rome, she became shorthand for decadence, a cautionary tale of what happens when women rule and men follow. Poets like Horace and Virgil wrote of her as a monster, a fatale monstrum, a fatal omen. They painted her as more serpent than queen, the opposite of Roman virtue. Yet even in their sneers, fascination leaked through. You don't write so much about someone you've forgotten. You write because she still haunts you. Centuries later, in the Middle Ages, Cleopatra resurfaced in stranger forms. European writers who barely knew Egypt beyond Bible stories included her in catalogues of wicked women, placing her alongside Eve, Jezebel, and Helen of Troy. She was demonized as the archetype of female ruin, the woman whose beauty toppled empires. Strangely, some medieval tales softened her, turning her into a tragic heroine who chose death rather than dishonour. Depending on the manuscript, Cleopatra was either a cautionary tale or a martyr of love. That duality, strange as it seems, ensured her survival in memory. By the Renaissance she had become muse. Artists adored the drama of her death. The asp against her breast, the golden couch, the bare shoulder slipping from her robe. Painters from Raphael to Caravaggio recreated the moment endlessly, each adding new flourishes. In their canvases, Cleopatra isn't merely dying, she's staging her own theatre. Some paintings emphasize eroticism, some majesty, some sorrow, but all share one thing: the fascination with a queen who turned death into art. Cleopatra, the ruler, faded. Cleopatra, the spectacle, burned brighter. Shakespeare pushed her myth further. In Antony and Cleopatra, she is no mere seductress or monster. She is witty, mercurial, unpredictable, and deeply human. His Cleopatra teases Antony, manipulates him, loves him, betrays him, mourns him, all in the space of a single act. Shakespeare leaned on Roman sources but injected his own strangeness. A Cleopatra who is both divine and petty, irresistible and exasperating. She is no saint, but she is unforgettable. And once Shakespeare had written her, she was woven into Western imagination forever. From there her myth ballooned. The Victorians adored her as the femme fatale par excellence. Poets like Tennyson lingered over her beauty. Painters lingered over her imagined jewels. By the 19th century, Cleopatra wasn't just a queen. She was shorthand for exoticism, decadence, and doomed romance. She adorned operas, novels, and even advertising posters. Perfume companies slapped her name on bottles, as if the scent of rose oil and danger could be bottled and sold at department stores. And then came Hollywood. In the 20th century, Cleopatra became one of cinema's favourite obsessions. Silent films, draped actresses in shimmering gowns, surrounded by papier-mâché sphinxes. Then Elizabeth Taylor's Cleopatra in 1963 exploded across screens. Eyeliner thick enough to stop traffic, sets dripping with gold, entrances choreographed as if by Cleopatra herself. The movie nearly bankrupted the studio, but the image stuck. Cleopatra as sensual goddess, equal parts femme fatale and tragic heroine. Generations who never cracked a history book knew her face from Taylor's gaze. Through it all, the strangest thing was how each age remade her in its own image. To Rome, she was the foreign witch. To the Middle Ages, she was a cautionary emblem. To the Renaissance, she was muse. To Shakespeare, a dazzling contradiction. To the Victorians, a seductress. To Hollywood, a spectacle of eyeliner and empire. Cleopatra became a cultural mirror, reflecting whatever anxieties or fantasies each generation carried. She was less a person and more a canvas. Meanwhile, archaeologists hunted her remains. Tombs were dug, scrolls translated, coins examined. Coins, in fact, revealed something curious. Cleopatra may not have looked like Elizabeth Taylor at all. Her profile stamped on silver tetradrachms shows a strong nose, sharp chin, commanding features. Not classical beauty by Roman standards, but striking. And maybe that was her strangest trick. Not beauty as perfection, but beauty as magnetism. She didn't need symmetry, she needed presence. Eyeliner and charisma did the rest. Even today, scholars debate her. Was she truly a brilliant ruler? Or simply lucky until Rome crushed her? Was she manipulative? Or merely playing by rules designed against her? Was she in love with Antony? Or using him? Each question generates new books, plays, and films. Cleopatra remains a riddle no one can solve, a woman whose story is stranger for its contradictions. Perhaps the weirdest thing of all is how her myth outshone her empire. Egypt under Cleopatra wasn't always prosperous. Famines struck, debts mounted, Rome loomed, yet her image endures far brighter than the realities of her reign. Ask most people today about the Ptolemies, and you'll get blank stares. Ask about Cleopatra, and you'll hear pearls, snakes, carpets, Antony. She eclipsed her dynasty, her kingdom, even her enemies. She turned her life into a legend so strong that history itself bent to it. So as you step through the centuries, watching her shapeshift from monster to muse, villain to heroine, goddess to pop icon, you realise the strangest legacy isn't her death, her jewels, or even her romances. It's that Cleopatra refused to stay buried. Every era digs her up again, reclothes her in its fantasies, and lets her speak anew. She's eternal not because of mummies or monuments, but because story itself cannot let her go. The night deepens, and the palace grows hushed. The torches gutter lower, casting softer shadows that blur into each other like fading memories. Cleopatra's story has carried you through chambers perfumed with incense, across banquet halls echoing with laughter, and onto ships whose sails bled purple into the sky. You've followed her from youthful queen to goddess on parade, from lover and strategist to prisoner staging her own death. And now, in the stillness that follows, her presence lingers like the faint trace of perfume in an empty room. Tonight you linger not in marble halls, but in the quiet space where legend drifts into myth, and myth dissolves into dreams. What makes Cleopatra's tale so strange isn't only the spectacles she staged, the pearls dissolved in vinegar, the crocodile dung ointments, the perfumed sails. It isn't only the politics she spun like silk, the languages she mastered, or the generals she ensnared in her orbit. What makes it strangest is how her story never really ended. She became a shapeshifter, slipping from history into imagination, reborn each time someone needed her to embody danger, desire or defiance. In this way, she is less a person than a current, flowing across centuries, impossible to bottle, impossible to silence. Even now, when you close your eyes, you don't see the spreadsheets of grain shipments she negotiated, or the taxation reforms she likely enacted. You see the image she chose to leave behind. Cleopatra reclining on gold, jewels flashing, a serpent coiling against her arm. The scene is theatre, yes, but theatre so strong that it swallowed fact whole. Strangest of all, she knew this would happen. She understood that Rome could conquer her body, but only she could decide the costume of her ghost, and yet beneath the spectacle there is a quiet hum of humanity. Cleopatra laughed at feasts, paced her chambers at night, worried for her children, tested poisons out of fear rather than cruelty. She was calculating, yes, but she was also fragile. A young woman in a world designed to consume her. If her strangeness shocks us, it may be because it reveals how far she was willing to go simply to survive. Every costume, every ritual, every banquet dripping with gold was a shield. Behind the coal and pearls stood a woman refusing to be erased. It is in that refusal that her strangest, softest power resides. She refused to be remembered as Rome's captive. She refused to let her lineage vanish into silence. She refused to bow to the idea that history belonged only to generals and emperors. Instead, she claimed her place, even if it meant becoming a myth. And by doing so, she reached us here 2,000 years later, her voice still curling through the dark like smoke from an ancient censer. Now the story itself slows, as if even the words are growing drowsy. The halls you've wandered fade into candlelight. The laughter of Antony, the speeches of Cicero, the jeers of Roman poets all soften until they are no more than murmurs behind a door you won't open again tonight. What remains is the image of Cleopatra's eyes, lined in kohl, bright with wit, heavy with secrets, watching from across centuries with a knowing half-smile. You feel your breath matching the rhythm of the Nile's eternal tide, slower now, steadier. The Queen's tale, with all its strangeness, has folded back into silence, leaving you cradled in its afterglow. There are no more pearls to dissolve, no more sails to perfume, no more crowns to polish. Only the hush of night, the faint echo of footsteps receding, and the comfort of knowing the story has been told. Let your shoulders sink into the mattress, let your jaw loosen, let your eyes grow heavy. Cleopatra's world drifts away, like incense smoke rising into the rafters until it disappears into the stars. You're safe here, in this quiet moment. Safe from the whispers of senators, the bite of asps, the weight of crowns. Safe to let go, safe to rest. So close your eyes. The Queen has gone to her rest, and now it is your turn. Sleep.